After Igor's escape, an enraged Oleg declared war on Dir. However, his counselors were not enthusiastic about the war, especially since Oleg was no longer Igor's guardian. There's an understated subplot here involving a general who will play a crucial role in the unfolding events.
I'm the prophet. And I can tell you that our victory is assured. My brother Dir will fall from the balcony of this palace, struck in the chest by an arrow fired by Prince Igor, heir to the throne and my beloved nephew.
A few days later, Dir also advanced towards Kiev with a large army, aiming to preemptively overthrow Oleg. On the way, the general arrived at Dir's camp, where Dir presented him with a large chest of gold and silver treasures. Although they didn't have further exchanges, I assume they must have reached some sort of agreement. When Dir's forces reached the gates of Kiev, the city walls were unexpectedly deserted, casting doubt on the eerie silence. But Dir calmly pushed open the gates, which were unlocked and empty. Ivar warned Dir that this could be a decoy strategy, but instead, a Rus officer emerged from the church, offering his sword in surrender and presenting the city to Dir.
Prince Dir, the army of Kiev salutes you and offers you and Prince Igor our profound love and loyalty from this day forward.
Soon after, the city's soldiers and civilians also emerged, welcoming the rule of Dir and Igor, thus revealing that it wasn't a trap laid by Oleg. It turned out that the general, having been bribed, had turned his back on Oleg, refusing to serve a leader who had lost power, allowing Dir to take Kiev without a fight. Meanwhile, Oleg was still muttering to a painting of Jesus, as if he too were playing the role of a merciful savior at that moment. It's unclear whether he had a genuine revelation or if he had no other choice due to his isolation. Oleg calmly walked onto the balcony and pleaded with Igor for peaceful coexistence.
My brothers, let us all live in peace together. Igor, I love you like a son. And you, Ivar, like a brother.
But who would believe him, aside from children? After all, Oleg had hurt too many people. Ivar handed Igor a bow and arrow, prompting him to end his own nightmare.
If we don't kill him, he will never be free. I love you, you know that.
Ultimately, Oleg's prophecy was fulfilled, but it was not Dir who was shot and fell from the balcony, but Oleg himself.
Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Later, Kattegat told Ivar that she was pregnant with his child. Ivar was speechless and stood frozen, unable to believe he was going to be a father. At Oleg's funeral, Ivar shared the news with Hvitserk. Ivar knew he didn't belong there. He still wanted to return to Kattegat. Since Kattegat's home was there, she wouldn't leave with Ivar, but she promised to raise their child well and ensure the child knew of his father's heroic deeds. Kattegat was aware that Ivar's love was for Fritis, and she was merely her substitute. The one who was most sad to see Ivar go was Igor. After all, Ivar has been the best friend to him, and Ivar indeed saw himself reflected in Igor. Though Igor was physically able, his guardians had always restrained him, so he often mocked himself as a cripple. Now that Igor was free, Ivar could leave with peace of mind.
Everyone here loves you. I wouldn't go if I didn't think you were safe. You're safe. And you will be king.
Seeing Ivar develop such affection for a boy confirmed to Hvitserk that Ivar had truly changed. He was no longer the cold, merciless tyrant he once was. When they returned to Kattegat, the disgusted attitude of everyone towards them could be imagined. Harald wanted to know their purpose for returning. Ivar explained that the Rus were merely a means to reclaim their homeland, and his conflict with Bjorn was just a difference in stance. After all, Harald had personally killed his own brother, so he had no right to judge Ivar. Moreover, as sons of Ragnar, they had every right to claim their place there. Ivar expressed his willingness to support Harald's rule, given that he had no other choice. Hearing that the sons of Ragnar were willing to support him, Harald immediately changed his attitude and publicly spoke well of Ivar and Hvitserk. Although the brothers were deeply hated by the people, Harald's ability to sway public opinion was second to none. After all, his ascension to king was largely due to his eloquence.
Ivar regrets the way he ruled here.
He was young. The responsibility was too great, and he forgot the lessons of his father. He never meant to kill Lagertha. How could he ever mean to kill such a goddess? They have both confessed their sorrows and their mistakes to be judged by their own people.
Although the people had accepted Ivar, he was still restless, living an idle life. He was determined to return to Wessex to challenge Alfred once again. Harold was utterly bored as well. He had spent his entire life pursuing the Norwegian crown, but after achieving his dream, Harold found himself without a purpose. Thus, he decided to accompany Ivar to Wessex. They aimed to bring the flames of war to the last bastion of England.
Is it for this that Ragnar Lothbrok died? Is it for your easy living, your temperate days, that he sacrificed his life? Since his death, the Christian plague has spread across the world, even infecting our Rouge brothers. But you still claim to be Vikings. Then act like Vikings. Forget about your comfortable existence. Come with me and conquer King Alfred. Come with me and conquer England and all of its riches. Reclaim your birthright. Be like the gods and reach for Valhalla!
The people who had wanted to punish Ivar days earlier were now swayed into supporters by his rhetoric. So, what direction will this final battle take, and how will the fates of the main characters unfold? The Viking army once again advanced toward England. It wasn't long before the Viking army reached the border of Mercia. Upon learning that the enemy had 200 warships, Alfred decided that retreat was the best strategy. He knew his existing army couldn't defend Winchester, so he led his troops to Chichester to regroup with other forces and left the empty city to the enemy. Elswith could not understand Alfred's seemingly cowardly actions, nor could she tolerate these barbaric Vikings. They kept invading and causing destruction, and even after receiving payments and land, they would return for more. Even if the Vikings were defeated, the merciful king wouldn't execute them but instead allowed them to convert to Christianity. But the Vikings were never truly converted. They invariably reverted to their old ways of invasion and plunder. Elswith was right, and Alfred also realized that these greedy Vikings could never be satiated. But the truth was they were not currently capable of battle. However, the English were not entirely inactive. One day, while Ivar led a hunting party in the wilderness, they killed a deer. But upon closer inspection, they found the deer had been deliberately tied there. When Ivar sensed a trap, a troop suddenly charged out of the woods. After a brief skirmish, Ivar's party was clearly at a disadvantage, as they were just a hunting party and not prepared for battle. Just in the nick of time, Hvitserk arrived with reinforcements. Once Hvitserk's troops merged with Ivar's, the advantage shifted from the English to the Vikings. Then Hvitserk ended the skirmish with a well-thrown axe that killed the enemy commander. Afterwards, the Vikings burned every village they passed through, leaving many villagers homeless and displaced, while King Alfred fled without fighting. Elswith tearfully criticized Alfred's inaction, but Alfred made a classic remark.
It is only important that Ivar does not capture me, for I am Wessex.
However, Ivar hadn't planned to attack Winchester in the first place. He wanted to choose his own battleground, so he picked a place called Edington. This was the perfect battlefield in Ragnar's eyes when he first brought Ivar to England. On the way to Chichester, Bishop Aldulf had already rallied the troops again. At night, Alfred cuts off his peacetime hair, and his flat head signals his determination to fight. Afterward, Alfred delivered an inspiring pre-battle speech. He assured everyone that they would no longer make deals with the devil, nor compromise with these barbarians.
Wessex will never return to the Dark Ages. Wessex will be a beacon for the rest of our country. A beacon of light, a beacon of liberty. We shall never surrender, whatever the cost.
Inside the Viking camp, Ivar and Hvitserk discussed their ideals, but Ivar's eyes turned a deep blue again. Hvitserk remembered from their childhood that every time Ivar's eyes turned blue, there was a risk of fractures. In recent years, the frequency of Ivar's blue eyes had increased, meaning he could fracture at any moment. The English king was also suffering. Alfred fell into another unconscious state. As before, his frail health caused him to faint frequently, and no one knew exactly what was wrong with him or how to treat it. Ivar's legs finally gave out too. That day, he suddenly fractured his right shin while walking, and despite his braces, he still fell to the ground. Nevertheless, Ivar endured the severe pain and managed to get back to his bed. Hvitserk, seeing Ivar's blue eyes, urged him to rest. But Ivar, looking at the spot where he fell, suddenly thought of a strategy. That was to make the enemy crippled as well. How he planned to implement this strategy and how the final battle would unfold, we shall see. To lay claim to a stranded whale, Kjetil drove everyone out of Greenland. However, once at sea, Ub and his party were even less able to survive, as they had neither food nor fresh water. Ub felt deeply guilty, as it was his blind trust in others that led them to such dire straits. Fortunately, fate had not abandoned them completely. They encountered a rainfall, which provided them with enough water to live for a few more days. Still, several days later, they continued to drift at sea. The rainwater they had collected was nearly gone, and everyone lay collapsed on the boat, waiting for a miracle, but misfortune seemed to always be ahead. A boy, unable to endure, drank seawater and died on the small boat the following day. Ub's faith was nearly shattered, and his son Ragnar was also barely holding on. He couldn't understand why the gods were testing him so. He regretted ever leaving Kattegat. He didn't want to die here either. Just as Ub was shouting at the sky and questioning the gods, Other mocked him coldly. He mocked that even a son of the renowned Ragnar could lose his faith. Before Other could finish, Ub unleashed his fury on him. Torvi quickly intervened to stop Ub, arguing that if he continued to fight like this, he would be no better than Kjetil.
You tried to murder one another! We are just like Kjetil and those we left behind! Over! For the love of the gods!
Days passed again, and their condition could only be described as hanging by a thread. Ub could only squeeze a bit of water from a rope onto his son's lips. Everyone lay collapsed on the boat, awaiting their fate. After what seemed like an eternity, Ub actually spotted land, which like a shot of adrenaline, revived everyone's spirits. And indeed, it was the fertile golden land they had long dreamed of, finally giving them hope of survival. Ub sincerely apologized to Other, and the two men hugged and wept, grateful that they hadn't given up hope. Just as Other had described, it was a land of beautiful scenery with towering mountains. The cries of seagulls breathed life into them, and the trees in the woods showed them a future. After filling their bellies and resting sufficiently, they began to explore the forests. They had never seen such beauty. Even calling it a paradise would not be an exaggeration. Everywhere was lush vegetation and fruits within easy reach, and the area teemed with all kinds of birds and animals. This place would surely fulfill everyone's dreams of settling down, especially coming from a barren land like the Vikings had. Later, they spotted a deer, and this time they wouldn't have to go hungry. Ub, eating the deer meat, smiled like a child. He hadn't felt this happy in a long time. One day, while hunting, Other found a strange marking, and they realized that there were other peoples living on this continent. To show goodwill, they placed several gifts near the marking. The next day, the gifts had been taken, and in the same place, the other party had left their own gifts. Nad steals a small piece of gold among the gifts when everyone isn't looking, and he'll pay for this greed later on. At night, a piercing laughter echoed through the woods, and Other deduced that it was the sound of the Skraelings. According to historical records, the Skraelings were the natives Vikings encountered when they landed in North America, meaning Ub and his party had indeed set foot on the continent of North America. Ub believed that the exchange of gifts indicated no hostility, so they should follow the tracks to investigate further. Indeed, they found a camp, but it was deserted. Just as everyone was puzzled, a group of Skraelings suddenly surrounded Ub and his party, their bodies painted in red and white. Then a group of women and children followed a man out. Pemanuit broke an arrow to show they meant no harm. Seeing this, Torvi also told everyone to lower their weapons and approached with her son to negotiate with Pemanuit. After introductions, Pemanuit invited them to meet their chief. Although they didn't speak the same language, Torvi guessed Pemanuit's intention. Their chief was a woman named Pakatalit. Pakatalit introduced her family and welcomed Ub and his party. Then Ragnar suddenly began to cry. When Nikani, Pemanuit's wife, moved to comfort him, Ub instinctively rejected her. But when Pakatalit spoke a word of Viking, Ub allowed her to touch his son. The child stopped crying immediately at the sight of something novel, and the other children were also curious and touched others' big beard. The tense atmosphere in the room quickly eased. Ob then invited the Skrins to the camp, where they gave each other gifts and demonstrated their unique weapons and fighting skills.
Yarna.
But these were not the main focus. Ob wanted to know why Pekatolik could speak the Viking language. After several attempts at communication, Pekatolik finally understood what Ob meant, revealing that she had learned the Viking language from a madman. The next day, they took Ob to find this madman. Before they even landed, Ob saw familiar crafts on the trees, all depicting the great stories and gods' totems of the Vikings. What struck Ob most was a depiction of Bjorn bear hunting, the Notre Dame Cathedral, and the Battle of the Seine. Moving on, they see another treehouse, and carved into the pillar is the site of the legendary Viking leader Ragnar being entangled in a viper.
Ragnar.
Seeing this, everyone likely guessed who this madman was, the only person capable of such divine craftsmanship and knowledgeable of these tales. As the treehouse mechanism slowly lifted, a familiar face descended from within the treehouse.